week 14 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few kickers I looked at off the waiver wire this week. The first guy, Matt Gay of the Indianapolis Colts. So Matt Gay, it's been another great season for him after signing a huge contract in the offseason to go from the Rams to this Indianapolis Colts team in the last 3 out of 4 weeks, double-digit fantasy points. Week 9 at Carolina, 11. Week 10 at the Patriots, 6. Week 12 versus Tampa Bay, 10. And Week 13 at Tennessee, 14 fantasy points. So right now, this is a team that they've had to settle for a lot of field goals this season, but they do get in the red zone a lot, is this Indianapolis Colts team. And they've put up some decent games, scoring the football as well. So Week 14, a good matchup at the Cincinnati Bengals. Give up the 9th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. A bend but don't break defense as well for the most part. And this offense as well is an offense that stalls out. So right now available is Matt Gay in tons of fantasy leagues here, still at 63%. The next kicker is Greg Zuerlein of the New York Jets. So Greg Zuerlein's pretty much been 50% of the New York Jets offense this season. He's available in tons of leagues at 92%. And the last few weeks here for Greg the Leg, I know the numbers have dropped off a little bit. Week 12 versus Miami, 1. And Week 13 versus the Falcons, 7 fantasy points. But Week 14, a good matchup versus the Houston Texans. They give up the 11th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And like I said, this Jet team, it might be in this game, we're going to see Trevor Siemian start at quarterback. And he's not any better than a Tim Boyle or Zach Wilson. Pretty much all these quarterbacks for New York are the same. And it's a problem all season with New York. I don't know how they didn't get a viable quarterback to back up Aaron Rodgers. But anyway, 50% of the offense is Greg Zuerlein. This Jet team, they stall out a lot. They don't find the end zone. And this week, I would give them an ad. The next kick is Jake Moody of the San Francisco 49ers. I know this Niner team, the last few weeks, it's pretty much just been all extra points. But when you're on a high-powered offense like Jake Moody is, he's a kicker that's going to be owned in more than 50% of fantasy leagues. Moody now out there in 57% of fantasy leagues. He's a kicker that's got his confidence back after him and the Niners as a whole. In those middle weeks from Week 6 to Week 8, they just had a hiccup losing 3 in a row. And ever since then, they've come out and destroyed teams 4 games in a row, and especially sending a message in Week 13 at Philly, winning 42-19. So the last few games for Moody, Week 11 versus Tampa, 9. Week 12 at Seattle, 7. And Week 13 at Philly, 6. So Week 14, a matchup versus the division foe. Going back to San Francisco versus the Seattle Seahawks. He gave up the 14th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. Like I said, Jake Moody's got a big boot. They drafted him in the 3rd round for a reason in the NFL draft, and he's on a high-powered offense. I definitely would give him an ad this week. The next kicker, Chris Boswell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Chris Boswell, it's been a solid season here for Boswell, and he's on an offense as well that stalls out a lot and doesn't find the end zone, and they settle for at least 2-3 field goals per game pretty much. Mitchell Trubisky will be starting quarterback for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. So Chris Boswell, over the last few weeks, he's been a pretty serviceable kicker. Week 10 versus Green Bay, 13. Week 11 at Cleveland, 4. Week 12 at Cincinnati, 11. And Week 13 versus Arizona, 4. But Week 14, it's going to be a low-scoring game on Thursday night, and possibly one of the worst Thursday night games you're going to see all year versus the Patriots. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So right now, Boswell available in 51% of fantasy leagues. He has a pretty good boot, and he's got a good matchup, and he's in an offense that stalls out. I would give him an ad this week. And the final kicker I looked at off the wall is Daniel Carlson. Las Vegas Raiders. Carlson, he's got dropped in tons of fantasy leagues over the bye week in 24%. Available right now in 61% of fantasy leagues. Here's Daniel Carlson. So the last few seasons, he's been a top 10 kicker in fantasy football. This season, it's been a mixed bag of results, but it's been an inconsistent offense. And an offense that's had trouble finding the red zone for the most part is the Vegas Raiders. So the last few weeks here for Carlson before the bye in Week 13. Week 9 versus the Giants, 14. Week 10 versus the Jets, 14. Week 11 in Miami, 8. And Week 12 versus the Chiefs, 5. So this week a good matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings. Back home is this Raider team. They give up the 6th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. That possibly could be a mini shootout between these two teams. So Carlson available in 61% of fantasy leagues. That's a few kickers I looked at off the wire in already Week 14 of the fantasy football season.